Hello and welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about training zones. Now I bet you own one of these, a cycling computer, and you probably own a heart rate monitor, and at some point you've probably tried to figure out your training zones and done some mathematics and got yourself really confused as to how many zones you've got and that sort of thing. Anyway, today's video we're going to be trying to make some sense of that, and I've got a little presentation for you to see if we can work all this out without any complicated mathematics. Sound good? Let's take a look. Right. Let's get stuck into why this got so complicated. Three things are in play here. So your rider, how you feel is dead important. If you've been like working with a Sufferfest, you probably see like the Suffer scale or RPE, rated perceived effort, scale of 1 to 10, and maybe you've been to a sports science lab and spent some time with the Borg scale. And then maybe you've got yourself a heart rate monitor, which is like the first sort of bit of a training tool that we buy as an athlete, whether a runner, cyclist or whatever. And you suddenly got like your max heart rate. What's your max heart rate? Is it 220 minus your age, or have I got to get it tested? And how do I test it? Do I want to test my max heart rate? And like, okay, so what about my threshold heart rate, and how do I test that? And actually, I did a test, and my Garmin told me that it was this much, and is that right? I'm not so sure. And maybe you're using your MyZone, or it's like heart rate reserved, or Fitbit works on your resting heart rate, and I've got 5 zones and like this, and then this thing's got 6 zones, and you get the idea. It gets pretty damn complicated pretty quickly, and it gets quite contradictory. Like one website will say like 55%, another one will say like 72%, and you're like, help. And if you've got a power meter, this gets even more complicated, because all of a sudden you go, well, my heart rate zone of this doesn't correspond to my power zone here, and I've got my FTP test and my CP60. I've done my 4DP test with the Sufferfest, but then like, how does that correlate to like my heart rate? And like, oh, I've got 8 zones in power, but I've only got 6 zones in. Like, what's going on? So, the thing is, what we're trying to do with all this zoning is to try and distinguish some points where your body goes through a physiological change. If you think about from getting out of bed in the morning to like running away from a herd of cows, scared of cows, then your body has to go through lots of different things in order to be able to do that. And this is what we're trying to do with your zones, is trying to ascertain what physiological changes are happening in your body in order to produce that level of intensity of exercise. And over the years, lots of academics have figured out that at this point, you know, like lactate accumulation that happens here, and they've done some science, and they said, you know, with some degree of certainty, that we can say that at this percentage of max of heart rate, that the majority of people, this physiological change will happen around here. Might not be for every single person. We're all very different humans. So, which is why knowing your zones and what they represent in your mind is just as important as what all these fancy tools are telling us. And that's what we're going to get into. Right, let's have a look at zone 1. So zone 1, this is what we call your move-in zone, sometimes called your recovery zone. And zone 1 is super important. This is you getting out of bed in the morning and doing something rather than nothing for the day. So recovery is not just sitting around, this is active recovery. You're elevating your heart rate enough so that you're increasing blood flow. Great for injury rehab as well, because blood flow is getting to those injured parts and making those repairs. In training, it's getting into there and making those adaptations, you know. So zone 1 can also be done for skill acquisition as well as yoga and Pilates, and maybe doing some weightlifting technique or some pedal technique work, or some balance work, that sort of thing. Anything that's going to actually improve your something, but still keeping your heart rate nice and low. Should be able to maintain like dinner level, you know, having dinner with someone level of conversation with this. Definitely shouldn't be sweating. It's just like walking intensity. Cool. Zone 2. This is the most important zone for a cyclist, especially if you're into endurance cyclist. And I call this the forever zone, quite often called endurance, because as long as you're eating and drinking enough, you can stay in this zone pretty much indefinitely. Well, about 9 months, according to a recent study, but you'll find something else on YouTube about that. And this is actually when we take on a new athlete on a coaching program and prescribe some zone 2 work, we often get kicked back on this, going, oh, it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything, it's a little bit boring, doesn't really feel like I'm making the best use of my training time. We hear it all the time, but I promise you, the athletes that can spend time in zone 2 excel and get their head around it, because it's quite good fun once you get your head into it. You know, it's nice, it's relaxing, you can spend some time with your mates and take in the scenery and enjoy it. The best thing is, it's got loads of good fitness benefits, but it's not fatiguing, which means you can commute to work, commute home, do multiple hours of this and really build up a fantastic aerobic base fitness, but not be too tired. So when we come and do our hard stuff later, you can really, really have the energy to attack them. Zone 2, super important. So this is definitely sweating a little bit, maybe talking in sentences of about 10 words. Feels like you're doing some sort of exercise now, but definitely sustainable. So get that nailed. Zone 3, so this is what I call tempo zone, which doesn't mean an awful lot to a lot of people, so I like to call this is what we call doing it for fun. This is great. You can go out, attack the corners, get a bit racy on the climbs. You're definitely eating, drinking, sweating a bit, putting some effort in and having a right good time. You know, the adrenaline's up and it's not quite race pace, but it's a good spirited effort and it's good fun. And this is where most people will spend most of their time in zone 3. It'll level out around here. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you can get some really good fitness gains from zone 3. However, it does hit a limit. Once you've maxed out your fitness gains in zone 3, we have to look at other things, which is quite often when people start buying heart rate zones and Garmin, etc., to try and improve. But to improve, you've got to try and almost ignore this zone that's for fun, sadly. Which kind of brings me on to the next little thing. So, sweet spot. Now, I'll let you pause the video here and have a look through this. This is a chart adapted from a book by Andy Coogan. And I've just simplified it a little bit. So the benefits of training are down there on the left-hand side. The 2 bits in red are up there for muscle hypertrophy. It's not necessarily a good thing for cycling. Strength, force production, yes. Hypertrophy, not necessarily. So just bear that in mind. And as you can kind of see, the sweet spot represents quite a lot of bang for your buck. You know, you get a lot for your training time in sweet spot. Which is good. And if you've got 5 or 6 hours a week to train, then sweet spot training is really good for you. So it's the time crunch cyclist type of stuff. So, but if you really want to get those performance gains, then we move on to like a more polarized thing where we spend a lot of time in easy and a little bit of time hard, and we tend to ignore this zone a bit. So that's a video for another time. Let's get back to our zones. Zone 4 for kicks, so quite often called threshold zone. This is like the racing zone. If you're doing a cross-country mountain bike race, a cross race or a crit race or something that's about an hour and a half of activity, the chances are you're spending an awful lot of time with that in your threshold zone. And threshold is hard. This represents a point where you've almost maxed out your aerobic system and you're having to use your glycolytic system as well. And which means that you're accumulating lactate, and that lactate is now becoming the inhibiting factor in performance. Now you can hold this for a fairly decent amount of time, half hour to an hour, which is where your FTP comes from, because the onset of lactate is the limiting factor here, and it's like pain in your legs almost instantly. The second you enter zone 4 is when you start feeling, oh, something's going on in my legs. You know, how long can I sustain this? And you start making those questions. That probably means that you're in zone 4. You'll definitely be sweating, be talking in broken sentences, having to break those sentences up with pants for breath. Sweat will be pouring off your brow, breathing heavily, concentrating to try and stay in this level of intensity. It's pretty unpleasant, but it's going to be over in a relatively short length of time. Okay, which leads me on to, boom, zone 5. So these zones now start getting a little bit more indistinct, whereas zone 2 was easy and you could ride with a big bunch of people. It's a very broad zone aerobically. These now get quite narrow bands to sort of stay into. So zone 5, sometimes known as the VO2 max zone. Zone 5 is hard. like your chest is going to be expanding, like sweat dripping off you, like mucus coming out of your nose. It's really, really deeply unpleasant. But when you're in the adrenaline of a race and bombing it up a hill, or just trying to get to that finish line, or make a big attack or a big move, having these 3-4 minute punches available to you at this top end of VO2 max is super important tool for a cyclist to have. This is what we don't do it very often. This is when we're going for glory. which quite leads us quite nicely onto our final zone in this little talk, which is zone 6. And zone 6 quite often gets missed out because it only represents a very few seconds in a rider's time, and it's yeah, it's absolutely flat out. It's fast twitch muscles. It is absolutely the biggest, deepest, hardest effort you can possibly make until your legs just stop moving. I think it's important to represent, because if you can make a few of these little hits, it gives a better picture as to the cyclist's total ability. So, but yeah, you've only got seconds here, and if you're lucky, you might have seconds, a few bit of recovery, and a few seconds again later on. But it's zone 6. It's hard. If you're coming back from your ride and your little Garmin computer is reporting that you spent minutes at zone 6, start questioning some of your data, because probably not. All right. So why is all this important? Important thing is we understand like the sort of what I call the holy trinity of data, if you like. It's great. If you've got a power meter, it's instant, it's physics, it's force production, it's a power reading on your Garmin computer. And that's great. If you've got a heart rate monitor, you've got things like heart rate lag to worry about. But you also, these two things cross-check and back up how it is you're feeling, and knowing those zones in your mind and what's happening is critical. And if you're uploading this data to something like Training Peaks so your coach can analyze it, when your coach says, how did you feel? And you've been able to communicate with your coach in a way that we've just been talking about is super important, because it tells you if something's having a good effect or a negative effect. It tells you whether you're undertrained or overtrained. It tells you whether your numbers are actually accurate or not. It tells you whether you might be harboring a little bit of illness or a little bit of fatigue. It tells us, you know, whether there's an area of training that needs some work. It tells us whether those zones that we're prescribing with the power meter are right or not, you know, and maybe you need to come in for a retest, you know. So knowing those zones and knowing how they feel and how long you can spend in each one of those things, and recognizing those physical adaptations as they occur is super important. Like entering zone 4, that time when you instantly start feeling a bit of pain, like, oh, this is zone 4, I know that I can spend however long at zone 4. Or if you're into zone 5 because you've made a big attack, you're like, okay, well, I've spent 3 minutes at zone 5, now I need to like however many minutes at zone 2 to recover from that. And you have that picture in your mind backed up with all the data from all these fantastic tools. That's when we get the big picture. That's why these zones are important. Okay, if that's blown your mind a little bit, there is a bit of hope. If you want a simpler system, check out the 3-zone model, which I quite like, if I'm completely honest. And it's something that we're definitely playing with down here. It just goes on very easy, moderately hard, and very hard. And it's great actually, because you can assess it based on how many words are spoken at certain heart rates, etc. So it's sort of done on how much you can speak between breaths. And it's great if you're following a polarized training model where you're just going to be working either very, very easy or very, very hard. You're going to try and miss out that moderately hard bit in the middle, that zone 3, 4 tempo threshold area. So go and check it out, or let me know in the comments below whether you want that to be the contents of a future video. I'll be really keen to know. Okay. So that's about it from us. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, subscribe to the channel and give us some comments below. Always like to hear your feedback and give some ideas for future videos. Okay, thanks for listening. See you on the next one.